to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to Safe Inside. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Sandy.
Last time we had our discussion about the hidden epidemic of sexual abuse, and we're going to get into a topic today, which is the topic of some controversy. We're going to talk about trauma and the borderline diagnosis. Sandy, start us out.
Yeah, so some controversy. Might as well just wade in all the way, right?
let's just jump in.
Let's just jump in and wade in all the way and do this controversial thing. So borderline personality disorder has a reputation of being someone who's like really, pardon the term, but crazy. Or when we think about it, we think about things like movies such as Fatal Attraction, that kind of thing. So let's talk a minute, Jeremy, if it's okay, about some symptoms of borderline personality disorder. And then
let's set some kind of context. I think this is one of those, and we see it happen every few years, don't we? We see the young ones get a hold of another name and not have all the facts. And who knows, maybe you meet one or two pieces of criteria for something, but next thing you know, you and all your friends are saying, that's just my borderline, that's just my ADHD. We can be kind of casual at throwing around big words like this. So let's first establish what we're even talking about.
Yes, let's look at that a little bit, because I agree. I think we're way too casual around that, diagnosing ourselves or our family members or friends, and we want to be very specific. The thing about diagnosing, by the way, is it just literally gives clinicians a language to understand what's happening with different clients. That is the purpose of diagnosing. So it needs to be precise and specific. So when we're thinking about borderline personality disorder, there are a few symptoms, usually 9, that we look towards seeing if we have the criteria. There's 9 of them. I'm going to tell you what they are. For someone to have to suffer from BPD, they actually have to have at least 5 of these criteria over time. Okay, so it's got to be at least 5 of these. One is a pattern of severe mood changes over hours or days. Now, I'm saying that carefully because I don't know how many clients have come to me and said, I think I'm bipolar. Or my grandmother was bipolar. Was she diagnosed? I don't know. Did she have severe mood changes over hours or days? Maybe. So that's not just a symptom of being bipolar. A lot of times the severe mood changes can be symptoms of other types of diagnoses or just other issues going on, but for borderline personality disorder, right?
And let's be honest, sometimes those can be symptoms of being a human being.
I have my ups and downs some days too. You're exactly right. So I think I'm pretty human. So
we've and it's become so normal to kind of pathologize things in our society. And sometimes it can be validating to finally know to call a condition by its name. But sometimes you can experience that in a very destructive way. It's saying, oh, okay, well, there's this, and apparently there's nothing I can do about it. And this is going to limit the borders of how I can show up in the world and how people can even love me or not.
Right. Especially when we're talking about something like borderline personality disorder, because the connotations around that can be very negative at times. So yes, we want to make sure that we're very specific and know that, all of us are going to exhibit 1 or 2 or whatever of these traits sometimes in our lives. That's part of the human experience. This is going to be on a human continuum. And so as we look at the criteria, it's going to be more often than not way down on the criteria, way down on the continuum, more extreme, that kind of thing. Okay, so keep that in mind. You might go, oh, do I have this because I have this particular symptom? No, you probably just have that particular symptom unless you have 5 or more down on the continuum. The next symptom that we look for is extreme anger and severe problems controlling anger. And again, like the mood changes, that can be symptoms of a lot of other things, right? As well as just not knowing how to manage anger. Someone with borderline personality disorder will have strong kind of up and down relationships with their family and friends that can go really quickly, like light speed from very, very close to anger and hatred, like very extreme. And when you think about someone with BPD, they typically are extreme when it comes to feelings. They're always kind of way extreme one way or the other. One of the things that really characterizes borderline personality disorder is an extreme fear of and reactions to abandonment or potential abandonment or thoughts that they might be abandoned and extreme behaviors to avoid that abandonment. So typically that's usually a cue for me that I need to look closer for borderline personality disorder if I see that in a client. That's not a diagnosing by itself. Remember, you have to have 5 or more, but that's usually a signal for me to delve a little bit deeper. Someone who suffers from BPD will also have a rapidly changing sense of self that can cause sudden changes in goals, values, or behaviors. We're going to come back to all these symptoms actually here in a little bit as we talk about trauma. So remember
I'm already holding my questions.
Yeah. Remember these as we get to the trauma part. So, but I wanted to go through it kind of give us a framework to start with. And the next symptom is literally feeling disconnected from themselves, their body, or reality, or having paranoid thoughts. Now, I'm saying that can also be just some dissociation, right? But they feel very disconnected from themselves or their bodies or reality, and having paranoid thoughts, or both. Can be both and.
So as a very quick aside, if you've ever known somebody who had this diagnosis and you just maybe kind of wanted to keep your distance from them, or had a hard time knowing how to have any level of connection with them, take a little moment to try to imagine what it would be like to be in their shoes and how disorienting that would be.
Absolutely. And how sure you are going to be that you're going to be abandoned and rejected. Right. So speaking of that, when they're not feeling those extreme emotions one way or the other, there's ongoing feelings of emptiness. And that's really how many clients actually say that to me. I feel empty. I feel chronically empty. I feel empty. They say that word. It's kind of interesting. They can have self-destructive behaviors such as substance abuse, binge eating, a lot of unsafe sex with multiple partners, unsafe driving, reckless spending. They can have suicide attempts or self-harming behavior, cutting, hair pulling, burning, threats to kill themselves, things like that. These symptoms might look like other medical conditions or problems. So for an actual diagnosis, you need to talk with someone who is a qualified healthcare provider to be able to make that diagnosis. Okay, so keep that in mind. We diagnose it, mostly mental health providers actually diagnose BPD. We'll ask your medical history, we'll ask about your symptoms, we'll ask about the severity and the frequency of your symptoms. We'll ask about your family's health, your family's mental health conditions, things like that, so that we can also rule out other illnesses. Doctors might actually give you a physical exam as well. So make sure
you can imagine something like this would have to account for a whole constellation of things. You may want some proof of those things rather than just having somebody sit with you for 5 minutes and then say, here's your prescription.
Yeah, it's funny. I won't diagnose borderline personality disorder in the first 1 or 2 or 3 sessions. That's a diagnosis that needs to take time to really come about to see what's going on. And if I have to give that kind of a diagnosis to a client, we typically talk that through together, so that they know where this is coming from and what their thoughts are around their symptoms. Because as I go through the symptoms, some of those symptoms can feel very subjective, right? How do we define extreme anger? How do we define extreme love and then extreme hate? How do we define that? What do we measure that by? And so it is somewhat subjective. And clients certainly have the right and should be part of that diagnosing process, if at all possible, right? So we want to talk about sort of what in our field we call the etiology of BPD, but which means the cause or the foundation or the roots, or why do some people get this, right? Where does it come from? And it actually was not a diagnosis that was given before the 1970s. It's a fairly, in my lifetime, new. To some of y'all, that may seem like a long time ago, but to me, it seems like a new diagnosis, right?
I'd still consider that fairly new.
I think so, except I was told that 30 years ago it's not the 1970s. So there is that too.
I mean, I'm all the time walking in grocery stores and thinking, I remember when this song first came out, and then getting like mental whiplash, thinking like, I remember when this song first came out.
Yes, I can remember. Yes, when the original first came out. So anyway. So back in the 70s is when this was first diagnosed, and there's some different roots out of Rye that's called borderline personality disorder. There's nothing borderline about it, except that the person who suffers from it can sometimes feel a borderline sense of self, that without other people, how do they exist? Where do they fit in this world? And that who am I question is not answered very well.
Yeah. I hesitate to use this imagery because I don't want anyone to take the wrong meaning from it. But I do wonder if people with this diagnosis often would experience it like a symbiosis type of thing, where it feels like in order to exist, I have to be attached to someone else.
Yeah, I think so. And that's part of what leads me and many people who've worked in trauma to believe that there is a definite causal link between childhood abuse and developing borderline personality disorder. We know the studies show that there is a strong correlation, but I believe, as do many in my field, that there is a direct causation, and that we might better serve clients with diagnosing them with something like developmental PTSD or complex PTSD, which are not actual diagnoses at this moment that we're recording this, rather than a personality disorder. Because we know that.
I think you're about to answer what I was about to ask. I was about to ask, and what practically is the reason that it matters to draw this line?
Well, so for one thing, the type of treatment that we give, it does matter for that. However, for someone who has a personality disorder, say a narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, we can't fix that because it's who they are. We actually can help them abate the symptoms by teaching them how to manage in life in a way that is healthier and better for themselves and everyone around them. But we do know that if we treat clients who suffer from BPD for childhood trauma, many of their symptoms abate. They just go away.
And so and for the sake of those trying to follow along who are not, steeped in mental health information and terminology all day long, this is why it would be called a personality disorder, as opposed to being identified as trauma. A personality disorder if what's disordered is basically your whole personhood.
Yes, exactly. And about 20% of our population has a personality disorder. But again, that's more about their personality and who they are. And it's just ways that they operate as a person. This is just their personality. And we hear that, well, that's just my personality. Yes, that's exactly what a personality disorder is. But borderline personality disorder does not operate the same way. We actually can, through the use of things like dialectical behavior therapy, which is basically a type of treatment that teaches life coping skills, is really what that is. It's basically life skills, through use of EMDR, through the use of talk therapy, through the use of some other trauma treatments. We actually, someone who presents with the symptoms of borderline personality disorder, those symptoms can abate and go away.
I have, this is a personal belief, and it's a belief of mine in general, but I wonder, from your experience working over decades with people who have this diagnosis, I wonder how much it applies here. I do believe that people are often capable of a lot more and a lot more change than they believe they are.
Yes.
Contingent on whether they recognize that they have a choice in the matter. I
I
wonder how
agree.
much that applies here.
I agree 100%. I think that it's even just like with trauma, most people come to therapy thinking that the best we can do is just help them manage their trauma, when that's not true. We actually can do a whole lot more than that, right? We can help them live happy and healthy in their now. That's what trauma treatment does. We treat it. So, but if someone who's given a personality disorder diagnosis, there's no hope for change. It is who they are. So how are they going to change who they are? This is just how they are. They can manage it at best, right? And that's not necessarily true. And unfortunately, since people who suffer from borderline personality disorder have such extreme behaviors, sometimes it is seen as a negative connotation, because people find them sometimes difficult or uncomfortable to be around, or they feel like they're walking on eggshells because they might explode at any moment, that kind of thing.
You're so extra, that kind of thing.
You're so extra. And really, they have extra just trauma responses. It's not what's wrong with them, it's what happened to them. And it goes back to that core of trauma-informed care. We don't look at someone and say, what's wrong with you? It is really what's happened to you. And it changes how we feel about someone. And that also then changes about what becomes possible within the work of therapy, right? So a client needs to understand that it's not what's wrong with them. They're not inherently flawed. Borderline personality disorder is looked at as a character flaw, a personality defect, when really it's most likely a trauma response. It's a certain set of trauma responses to certain types of trauma.
And I think that gets to where, and I think more people are waking up to this, but that gets to where it can be such a negatively powerful thing to have a diagnosis placed upon you, because people are not adequately prepared to take that as this is a structure for how we're going to proceed with helping you. And
Right.
Instead, it becomes this cold, machine-like objective proof that you are broken. And that's not the truth, but it can certainly be the meaning that you draw from it.
Absolutely. And to me, it feels like, I think I said in a previous episode, that this misdiagnosis of this trauma response grouping feels cruel. And part of why it does, to me, is because it feels very similar to how Freud and Charcot labeled these women who had shared their trauma story as hysterical and fantasizing. And therefore, they put the blame on the victims. And then that way they could go about their life without looking at how much trauma is in people's lives. And in our last episode, we talked about the epidemic of child sexual abuse and how prevalent it is in our society, but we don't want to talk about it. It's just easier to say, children get over things, they're resilient, and you have borderline personality disorder, or worse yet, which goes all over me. You are a borderline, right? How
Right.
hateful is that statement? How hateful is that statement? And we say that when really, in reality, it's not what's wrong with these people. It's not a character defect. It literally is. They've experienced trauma and we need to treat that. And we need to be empathetic towards that. Oh my gosh, what has happened to you? Right?
It's so interesting to me that even the phrase "out of control" can be
Yeah.
interpreted. It can be interpreted in wildly different ways. For
Yes.
instance, you can look and say that kid is out of control. You need to learn to discipline your child. You need to not bring them out in public, whatever it is. But I mean, again, put yourself in the shoes of a person that you don't want to associate with because you don't know how to handle them. Imagine having that much going on inside of you that you don't even, you know, it like being thrown overboard and not being able to swim. Try to imagine you'd have an intense immediate response if everyday life had these surprise moments throughout it that made you think, I'm completely alone and I have no tether to reach for.
Right. Right. And not only are you alone, but like we talked about before, in that isolation, in that aloneness, you're being violated in one way or the other. What do you do with that? How do you learn to regulate your emotions in the midst of all of that? How do you learn who you are in the midst of all of that? We sort of know who we are partly by the reflection that we receive back from our connection with other people, right? So I think in our next episode, we're going to talk about how and why I believe borderline personality disorder is heavily linked or caused by childhood trauma.